First, though, former Reserve Bank board member Dick Warburton sounding a fresh call on boosting productivity this week in his role as head of industry lobby group Manufacturing Australia. It's very timely given the Australian dollar punched through resistance at 108 US cents in the wake of that Reserve Bank no change decision on rates Tuesday. Well, the motor car sector subsidy debates to one side. Just what will it take for the nation to do what it does do better when the idea of Destination Australia looks an ever-questionable proposition for migrants who are, of course, toying with the pain of a runaway local currency relative to their own? Well, joining me to discuss the productivity challenges ahead, Navitas English Executive General Manager Helen Zimmerman, and from our Sydney CBD studio, Bank of America Merrill Lynch Chief Economist Saul Eslake, former Director, no less, of the Productivity and Growth Program at the Grattan Institute. Warm welcome to you both. Saul, let's start with you. An intriguing interview with soon to assume the position on the Reserve Bank board, Heather Ridout, the AI group, just days ago, calling for a more sophisticated debate now than just simply jumping on a jet plane to Italy to grab a bargain. Are we in that space as a nation that we're pondering life at these levels seriously?
I think we are. One of the things I've learnt from my times in a commercial bank and now once again at an investment bank is that people running real businesses, by which I mean manufacturing businesses, services businesses of one sort or another, tend to change their views about the key economic variables in their operating environment much more slowly than people in financial markets. And that's not a criticism of either of those groups, but simply a reflection of the type of decisions that they actually take. People running real businesses can't make decisions about how they run those businesses in reaction to one piece of economic data and then change their mind 24 hours later. They have to take a longer term view. Many of them had been hoping that the rise in the Australian dollar and some of the other things we've seen emerge over the last few years, such as the substantial slowing in credit growth and the rise of internet shopping, would be temporary phenomena, and that after a little while they would go back to where they were, say, in the mid-2000s. But in the last 6 months or so, I think a lot of business people have come to accept that the Australian dollar is going to be stronger for longer. And that in turn has prompted them to ask some pretty hard questions about the viability of some of their entire lines of business, particularly those that are dependent on exports or facing heavy competition from imports, and in other cases where they've come to the view that their businesses could be viable even at a stronger dollar. They've also had to recognise that in order to ensure that they're viable in circumstances where the dollar's stronger for longer, they have to make some pretty radical improvements in the productivity and competitiveness of those operations. And I think it's that fundamental realisation that things have actually changed permanently rather than temporarily that many businesses have come to over the last few months is now driving some of the key organisational changes that we're seeing in workplaces across the nation.
Many businesses, though, Saul, I just pondered with you just briefly before Helen, is many enough? Because back on Heather Ridout saying in this other interview, really, we've got labour costs rising which are not being matched by productivity increases. She's taking a bigger picture view, but do you agree?
Yes, I think she's absolutely right. My research while I was at the Grattan Institute certainly convinced me that Australia's productivity performance had deteriorated quite substantially since the turn of the century, really, since the early 2000s, and that deterioration has intensified over the last 5 years or so, and that's a serious problem in the face of a very strong exchange rate. It didn't matter so much in the first half of the past decade when the currency was below 75 cents, at or below its long-term average. But now that businesses have come to recognise that the currency may well be at these sort of levels or higher for a lot longer than they would have thought until recently, that's forcing them to take a much harder look at fundamental questions like productivity than they've really had to do in many cases since coming after the recession of the early 90s.
Helen Zimmerman, to you on all of that, at the coalface of education, a sector that's grappling with that huge question over just why Destination Australia for students, and more to the point, the tweaking of the model to say quality comes first versus revenue. It might seem like a bit of a nuanced distinction, but are we actually up there with the best still, or are we starting to erode in education terms what we really should be standing for?
We are up there with the best, but that doesn't mean to say we don't have to get better. I think, you know, the BED review, the ESOS review, was called Stronger, Simpler, Smarter, and I think that's a very good summary. Australia's really well positioned, but we've taken a hit over the last couple of years, and it's given us a wake-up call. The Australian dollar is high and it's going to stay high. That's not where we will get any light, really. What we have to do is become more competitive. Saul was right. We have to take, and education does, a very long-term view.
By which you mean, what, a decade-long plus?
Yes, yeah. When international students are coming to Australia, it's not a quick decision. Their parents have been thinking about this often since they were born, particularly from China. It's a very big investment, and they want their children to come to a country that is going to provide them with a quality education and prepare them for their careers going forward in a safe and welcoming environment. And Australia needs to really think about that. It's a whole of Australia issue, really.
And define quality, because at the moment the battle that lines have been drawn and arguably the bar's been raised over just what it is that says they should come here versus, say, the US. Prime example.
Well, the US has always been the El Dorado for particularly Asian students. It's the #1 destination. It did go down after 9/11. Where the US was not so welcoming and tightened up visa restrictions. But they've changed that, and so the US is a very attractive destination. That doesn't mean to say that Australia has never been a very attractive destination. It's been #3 all the time, and that's a good place to be, particularly when you look at the stats that are there. We now have 3.7 million people moving around the world to study. That's going to go up, according to the OECD, to 8.2.
Philosophically, back to Saul in a moment, do we want an open door policy just for the sake of saying this is an open market, you are welcome, or do we actually want to start putting some barriers, very necessary ones, to say actually we're going to raise the bar and the quality of our degrees is not a given. Just because you might have been planning it from birth, you have to still, once you get here, prove the right to be studying, not taking it half seriously.
And the vast majority of international students are exactly like that. I mean, it's not easy. You've got to satisfy that you're a genuine student under the new regime, and you're coming here as a genuine temporary student. I think we had policy and visa settings that allowed some excesses and were not enforced. But the vast majority of international students are genuine students, and they're choosing Australia because of the quality of the educational experience and also the lifestyle and being able to live in a very globally connected country.
Saul, speaking of globally connected, the idea of having a global link to a fund that would make its investments offshore and maybe that act as a mechanism to drive down this dollar in some shape or form. That's not a debate that's really taken flight as yet. Why not?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that it should be an objective of any arm of policy to drive down the value of the Australian dollar. The dollar's playing an important role in helping Australia achieve something it's never been able to achieve before in our entire European history, and that is to have a commodities boom, and this is the biggest one we've ever had, without blowing it up in the form of double-digit inflation. And the dollar is helping achieve that goal, first of all, by keeping a lid on the price of imported goods and services, and secondly, by putting pressure on trade-exposed industries like manufacturing and tourism and to some extent higher education, forcing them to improve their productivity and competitiveness, and to some extent by shrinking as a share of national income to release resources that can be used for what for a decade at least, are going to be higher value uses in the mining and related sectors. So the dollar's playing a role. We know from times gone by when we had a fixed exchange rate and politicians wouldn't allow it to go up for fear of offending manufacturing and agricultural interests, that the result would be double-digit inflation. We don't want to repeat that.
I understand that, but if you were to sort of think of life when the cycle of mining comes to an end, you surely then have to be pondering seriously whether those same set other industries, you take manufacturing, shedding 44,000 jobs inside the last 12 months, has actually got a future.
Indeed, and that's a fair point. Let me again reiterate, though, that I think this mining boom's going to run on for a decade, so we shouldn't be thinking about short-term moves to save those number of jobs. Rather, the point is that those firms in those industries that are adversely affected by the strength of the exchange rate, and I acknowledge that they are only going to survive and be in a fit shape to drive growth in income and employment after the mining boom ends, whenever that might be, if in the meantime they improve their productivity and competitiveness, and the strength of the dollar is something that is forcing them to do that. So although I've long been a supporter of Australia having a sovereign wealth fund along Norwegian or Chilean lines, long before that became fashionable in some circles, I've never advocated that we do it as a means of dampening upward pressure on the exchange rate. Right. Indeed, if the exchange rate were all of a sudden to drop by 20 cents, as many people would wish, then one of the regrettable consequences would be that the incentives firms are now feeling to lift their productivity would go away, and we'd be repeating the mistakes of years gone by.
Except, Helen Zimmerman, to use the kind of economist jargon, the numerator and the denominator are kind of at odds with each other. That is to say, you're getting gains, for instance, in manufacturing on productivity terms, but at a great expense. And how do you keep the denominator, the idea of what's triggered that, in this case job losses, how do you actually quarantine that relatively? Because it seems that there's a big price to pay. If you're not in mining, you're feeling a lot of pain, and therefore big questions over housing and whole other ripple effects emerge.
Well, I think for the education industry, really, I mean, a high dollar hurts exporters. However, that's not really what's driving demand. It's a factor, but it's not the major factor. I mean, you look at Australia, it has a high dollar, but it's had a whole lot of regulatory and policy uncertainty and changes, and we've had falling demand, and we've had a number of other factors. You look at the UK, it's had a depreciating pound, but it's had a lot of regulatory uncertainty, and it's got falling demand. Look at Canada, and in fact it's appreciated against the US dollar, and it's got rising demand. So it's got no regulatory problems. It's a very nice regime for that. So I think really it's going back to what Saul's saying. In fact, we have to accept what's happening with the Australian dollar, and we have to look, government and industry, and in fact the community, at what we can do to make Australia more productive.
Is there anything, last time I spoke with you, you said the lucky country is not synonymous with being smart.
No.
So is there anything on that score that shoots home, that you've identified to say we should make a move in that regard?
Well, I think one of the things I see, and I think there are a number of others, Simon Margison's one of them in particular, is that we have to engage more meaningfully with Asia. On a level where
not
it's...
just a white paper, something beyond that.
Yes, that it's not just about, well, we've got this wonderful system and come to us. It's actually deep and meaningful engagement.
That said, Saul, you get the last say on that. Chinese productivity got a lot to answer for. If we use that as the Asian umbrella model, still they struggle, right?
Well, they are making big strides in productivity growth from what are very low levels, and that's characteristic of emerging and developing countries throughout history. I mean, China is travelling down the path that before it Japan and Malaysia and Korea and Taiwan and other emerging and industrialising countries are doing, or if you go back 100 years earlier to European countries and the United States. That's why they can afford the quite large wage increases that ordinary Chinese are now getting without pricing themselves out of international markets. For Australia, I'm not saying we need to adopt Chinese methods in order to to improve productivity. I think some of the suggestions Helen's just made about looking at the way our regulatory regime makes life more difficult for Australian higher education institutions competing with their counterparts in other countries, that's true for higher education, it's true for a whole lot of other sectors themselves. So governments can play a helpful role here in looking at the impact of their own decisions and frameworks on the ability of Australian firms to compete in the face of a high exchange rate, as well as firms taking a hard look at their own operations as well.
Yeah. It's very much a push-pull, but as you say, create the conditions and hope that business then picks up the slack. Saul Eslake from the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, thank you so much for coming on the show, and Helen Zimmerman as well. It's been valuable, it's been great, and we'll look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks
very much.
Appreciate it. When we come back,